When I saw my husband flipping through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not out of fear of being caught, but because of what he was about to see. Those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I tried to snatch the phone from his hands, but he quickly pulled it back and kept reading. I watched his face as it shifted, line by line, and felt my life crumbling in those seconds. Yes, he was about to know the truth, but not all of it. His hands were trembling as he turned the page, and I knew this was the moment when he'd find the one message that would ruin everything. The one that would either explain everything or make it even more complicated. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in his hands, and a new notification popped up. I saw his face go pale when he saw the sender's name. He froze. Not even blinking. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit I do when I'm nervous. My nerves mixed with the dread of realizing what I had done. His breathing became heavier. I could hear it, even from 2 meters away. It was exactly what I had feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake that had changed everything, and now. I had no idea what to do, but let me tell you how it all began. Before I share the secret I've been hiding for so long, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments, and also answer me this: have you ever had a secret you tried to hide with everything you had, but eventually, it all came crashing down? My life, at least from the outside, seemed perfect. I had a career that many would envy, a house that was always spotless, and a husband who, for the most part, was attentive and considerate. But inside, I was suffocating. The years had worn on me, slowly and steadily, until I found myself questioning everything. I loved my husband, or at least I thought I did. But I hadn't felt the spark in years. Our marriage had turned into something comfortable, predictable, like a well-worn sweater that had lost its warmth but was too familiar to throw away. I used to think I could deal with it. After all, what was I supposed to do? Divorce him? Start over? That seemed impossible, and frankly, I didn't have the energy for it. But the distance between us had grown wider, and I had no idea how to fix it. I could see it in the way he barely looked at me when we were in bed, or how he no longer made any effort to talk to me about his day. The conversations, when they happened, were functional: who was picking up groceries, what time the laundry needed to be folded. There was no spark, no intimacy. And worst of all, there was no passion. Sometimes I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he felt it too. Did he feel the emptiness between us? Did he ever miss the way we used to be? Or had he already checked out, just like I had? But I couldn't admit it to myself. I had spent years building a life around this man, around this relationship. I couldn't just let it go, could I? The fear of starting over was overwhelming, and the thought of being alone was even more terrifying. Then came the day I first saw him, my boss's son. I had heard about him for months but had never met him in person. He was still in college, only occasionally stepping into the office for brief meetings or errands. He was young, ambitious, and, from what I'd gathered, very charming. But when I saw him in person for the first time, it felt different. There was something about him, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just his looks, though he was undeniably handsome. It wasn't just his confidence, though that was unmistakable. No, it was the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel like I was more than just the head of a department. For the first time in ages, someone saw me. Not as a colleague or a wife, but as a person. I had to admit, I was intrigued. The first few conversations we had were harmless enough. He asked for my help with some work, a few questions about a project, and then a couple of suggestions on how he could improve his approach. But there was an undercurrent, something electric, something unspoken. He would smile at me a little too long, his voice just a little too smooth. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I found myself anticipating our next exchange, whether it was in the office or in passing. it wasn't that I wanted to do anything about it. I was married. I had a life. I had responsibilities. But that didn't stop the strange feelings that had begun to creep in. I remember the first time he offered to drive me home. It was late, and I had stayed at the office longer than I should have. I was tired, and the thought of taking a cab didn't appeal to me. He'd offered with a smile, and for some reason, I accepted. As we drove through the streets, the silence in the car felt charged. The hum of the engine was the only sound between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was like the quiet before a storm, peaceful, but full of potential. I glanced at him a few times, and each time, I caught him looking at me. There was something in his gaze that made me feel exposed, yet I couldn't look away. I should have gone home earlier, I said, breaking the silence. It's all right, he replied, his tone soft. I'm glad to keep you company. The way he said it, so casual yet with an undercurrent of something else, made me feel uneasy in a way I hadn't felt in years. But instead of distancing myself, I leaned in, just a little. He seemed to notice, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. We didn't talk much after that. I didn't know how to talk to him anymore. My thoughts were jumbled. He was young, and I was, well, not. He was my boss's son. This was wrong, wasn't it? So why did I feel like I couldn't stop thinking about him? As the car rolled to a stop outside my house, he turned to me with that same smile. It was genuine, but there was something else there, something I couldn't ignore. See you tomorrow, he said. Yeah, I answered, my voice shaky. Tomorrow. I had no idea that this small exchange would be the beginning of everything changing. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, feeling the space beside me where my husband should have been, and I realized, for the first time, how much I had been craving attention. But from whom? I couldn't bring myself to think about it anymore. There was too much at stake, too much I stood to lose. But deep down, I knew, everything was already changing. I had crossed a line without even knowing it, and I was no longer sure where this path would take me. In the days that followed, things at home only seemed to get worse. My husband's indifference became even more apparent. He came home late, left early, and when we did have a moment to talk, it felt like we were both just going through the motions. It was a relief to see him leave each morning. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I resented the lack of connection between us. It wasn't just the absence of affection, it was the absence of care. He wasn't interested in me anymore, and I had to face the ugly truth that I wasn't interested in him either. But what did that mean for me? For us? I had no answers. But I knew one thing, the more I thought about my husband, the more I found myself thinking about him. The young man. The one who had shown me what it felt like to be seen again. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I wanted to be seen. The next morning, everything felt heavier than usual. I got out of bed without waking my husband, though I doubted he would have noticed either way. He had started sleeping on his side of the bed like we were strangers sharing a room, and I didn't remember the last time he had reached for me, not even in sleep. I moved quietly, showered, dressed, and left the house with a numb efficiency that I'd perfected over years of pretending things were fine. At work, I poured myself into tasks with obsessive focus. I knew what I was trying to do, to distract myself, to bury whatever it was I had felt the night before. But thoughts have a way of surfacing when you least want them to. His face. His voice. The way his eyes held mine a second too long. Those things floated back to me again and again, and each time I would shake my head, push them away, and return to my screen. I didn't see him all morning. A part of me was relieved. Another part, a quieter, more insistent part, felt disappointed. I hated myself for it. I wasn't supposed to care. I wasn't supposed to feel anything. But around noon, he walked past my office. He wasn't even looking for me. He was just carrying some papers to the executive floor. Still, I felt it, how my breath caught, how my fingers froze over the keyboard. It was ridiculous. I was a grown woman. I had lived long enough to know that feelings like this were fleeting, even dangerous. And yet there I was, watching his back as he walked away like a girl too young to understand the cost of wanting. I managed to avoid him for the rest of the day. I told myself that was for the best. I told myself I was being mature. But by 5 o'clock, my heart started racing the closer I got to the end of the day. I began glancing at the clock every few minutes. I started noticing every sound in the hallway. When he appeared at my door, leaning in casually with that usual ease, my stomach flipped. "You need a ride today?" he asked, like it was nothing. And I should have said no. I should have smiled politely, told him I was fine, told him I had someone coming to get me, any lie would have sufficed. But instead, I nodded. Just that. A single, stupid nod. The drive was quiet at first. The city outside the windows blurred into twilight as we moved through traffic. He didn't try to talk, and I was grateful for that. I stared ahead, watching the taillights in front of us flicker like tiny signals, like warnings. Still, I said nothing. I don't know when it shifted. Maybe it was the way the sky turned darker or the way his hand tapped gently on the steering wheel to the beat of a song I didn't recognize. But somehow, we ended up talking about nothing and everything at once. Work. Weather. Music. Small things that shouldn't matter. But they did. Because with each word, the space between us felt smaller. He pulled up in front of my house and parked. I reached for the door handle without saying anything, but I didn't open it. I just held it there, frozen. Something was keeping me in the car. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was what I thought he was about to say. When I turned toward him, he was already looking at me. "We shouldn't," I said. I don't know why I said that. Nothing had happened. And yet, it felt like something had already crossed a line. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He just gave me this quiet look, like he was seeing something in me that I didn't want to admit was there. And then we kissed. I don't remember who leaned in first. I just remember the silence that followed. Not awkward. Not filled with regret. Just stillness. I opened the door after that, stepped out, and closed it behind me without a word. Inside the house, I didn't turn on any lights. I walked through the living room as if sleepwalking, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the couch with my coat still on. I told myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. That night, my husband came home later than usual. He didn't apologize, didn't explain. Just went straight to the bedroom, as if he didn't even notice I was sitting in the dark. And I just sat there, staring at the shadows on the wall, wondering how we'd ended up so far apart. I didn't sleep that night. My body was in bed, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. I kept replaying the moment in the car over and over. Not because it was romantic or thrilling, but because it made me feel something. And I hadn't felt anything like that in a very long time. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror for too long. There was nothing particularly different about my reflection. I didn't look younger. I didn't look like someone with a secret. But my eyes felt unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone I didn't recognize anymore. At work, I avoided him. Not out of shame, but out of fear. Fear of what might happen if I didn't. I needed to reset. To go back to who I was before. But how do you return to something when you've already stepped beyond the line? Midway through the day, I got a message from my husband. Just a casual note, asking if I wanted to have dinner that night. It was such a rare gesture that I didn't know how to react. I said yes. That evening, we went to a restaurant we hadn't been to in years. He tried. I could see that. He asked me about work. He told me about his clients. He smiled at me. And for a moment, I wondered if maybe we could find our way back to each other. But all I could think about was how it had felt, how that kiss had awakened something in me that I thought was dead. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to scream it out loud. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I wanted him to look at me the way that young man had. To see me again. To remember what it was like when we were more than two people sharing a space. But I stayed silent. I let him pay the check. I let him drive us home. I let him kiss me goodnight on the cheek and roll away to his side of the bed. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling again, I realized something I couldn't ignore. I had changed. Maybe it was small. Maybe it was just a crack in the foundation. But it was there. And cracks never stay small for long. That kiss wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. One I had been too afraid to look into for far too long. The following week unfolded in quiet, heavy layers, as if life itself had shifted slightly out of focus. Each morning, I dressed with the same mechanical routine, put on the same neutral-colored clothes, applied the same makeup to the same aging face, but something in me refused to settle into the rhythm that had once felt so predictable. There was a subtle tension beneath everything, like a glass stretching just past its limit, not yet shattered, but on the edge. At work, I kept to myself. I buried myself in spreadsheets, memos, and strategy documents. I lingered longer than necessary on meaningless details, hoping that if I focused hard enough, I could erase the memory of what had happened in the car. But our memories don't follow logic. They live in the curve of your spine, in the palms of your hands, in the ache behind your ribs. And mine refused to leave. I hadn't spoken to him since that night. He hadn't tried either. We passed each other in hallways and meetings, nodded politely when necessary, but said nothing more. A fragile truce made of silence. I told myself that was for the best. But each time he walked by, I felt my breath catch, just for a second. It wasn't about romance or some adolescent fantasy, it was about being seen. About feeling something again. And the worst part was, I didn't trust myself anymore. At home, things were almost aggressively normal. My husband was, for the first time in months, putting in effort. He asked about my day. He made coffee in the morning before I woke up. He even suggested we take a weekend trip, just the two of us. Something we hadn't done in years. On the surface, it looked like the universe was giving us another chance. But it all felt a little too late, like trying to water a plant after its roots had rotted. I wanted to respond with gratitude, with openness. But my reactions felt rehearsed, delayed, like I was playing a part one no longer believed in. One evening, as I was clearing the table after dinner, he came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. A simple gesture. Familiar. He used to do it all the time when we were younger. For a second, I let myself relax into it. But the comfort I once found in his touch wasn't there. My body felt tense, stiff, unwilling. I didn't pull away. But I didn't lean in either. He kissed the top of my head and told me I seemed distracted lately. I laughed, forced and thin, and told him work had been stressful. He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. But that was the thing about us now, we'd both become so good at pretending. The weekend came and went in a blur of polite conversation and shared meals. We drove out to the coast, stayed in a quiet inn by the water, walked on the beach like strangers mimicking what they thought closeness looked like. I kept wondering, if I hadn't kissed someone else, would I be trying harder? Or had I kissed him because I'd already given up? I stared at the waves for hours. They moved the same way they always had, predictable, eternal. And yet, I felt as if I'd never really seen them before. There was a line between who I used to be and who I was now, and somewhere along that shoreline, I realized I'd already crossed it. When we returned to the city, the first thing I did was head to the office early Monday morning, long before anyone else arrived. I needed space, silence, time to think without eyes on me. I sat at my desk with a coffee that had gone cold before I even took a sip. The computer screen glowed in front of me, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about who I was before all of this. Before the distance, before the kiss, before I had to question the structure of everything I had built my life around. I had always been so careful. So composed. Never one to cross lines or break rules. I followed the path set before me. And yet here I was, sitting in an empty office at dawn, feeling like a woman I didn't fully recognize. Later that morning, I saw him again. Just briefly. He was talking with one of the junior managers near the elevator. He laughed at something she said, and the sound hit me harder than it should have. It wasn't jealousy. It was something deeper. A reminder that he existed beyond me. That our moment in the car hadn't changed him. Only me. I turned and walked in the other direction. That afternoon, my husband texted me, asking if I could leave work early and meet him for lunch. He said he had something he wanted to talk about. I almost declined. But curiosity got the better of me. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind we used to go to in our first years of marriage. He had already ordered our food by the time I arrived and looked oddly nervous. That alone should have warned me. My husband was rarely nervous. We talked about mundane things at first. Then he leaned in and said he felt like we'd been drifting apart. I nodded. I didn't have the energy to deny it. He said he wanted to change that. That he missed me. That he wanted us to reconnect, to be the couple we used to be. He mentioned couples therapy. He said he was willing to do anything if it meant fixing what we had. And I believed him. I truly did. But the timing felt cruel. Because I had already started to grieve the loss of our marriage. And it's hard to save something you've already buried. I told him I needed time. That I wasn't sure what I felt anymore. That I would think about it. He looked wounded, but he nodded. And for the first time in a long time, I saw vulnerability in his eyes that wasn't laced with frustration or distance. That night, I stayed late at the office. Everyone else had gone home. I didn't even realize how late it had gotten until I looked up from my computer and saw the empty floor. I stood, stretched, and walked to the break room to refill my water bottle. He was there. I hadn't heard him come in. He stood by the counter, pouring coffee like it was the most normal thing in the world. He looked up and smiled. Not coy. Not confident. Just normal. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't prepared for this. He asked if I'd been avoiding him. I said no, too quickly. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly and said, "Okay." And I realized that maybe he wasn't going to chase me. That maybe whatever had happened that night wasn't some game to him. Maybe it was just as complicated for him as it was for me. We didn't say much after that. I returned to my office. He left not long after. But something shifted that night. Not between us. Within me. I couldn't keep living in limbo. I had decisions to make. Ones that would change everything. But the truth is, I didn't know what I wanted. Or worse, maybe I did, and I was just afraid to admit it. What scared me wasn't the kiss, or the possibility of something more with someone new. What scared me was that for the first time in years, I was no longer content with the life I had built. And I didn't know if I ever would be again. I spent the next few days walking through my life as if I were watching it from behind glass. Everything looked the same on the surface: the morning coffee, the routine emails, the soft click of my heels on the office floor, but nothing felt the same. It was as if I had stepped just slightly out of alignment with the world, and now I couldn't figure out how to snap back into place. I wanted things to feel normal again, truly I did. I wanted to look at my husband across the dinner table and see him the way I used to see him, someone solid, familiar, safe. I wanted to go to work and feel accomplished without questioning who I had become in the process. I wanted to close my eyes at night and not replay the kiss, not question what it meant, not wonder what it said about the life I had chosen. But the truth was, I had changed. Quietly, imperceptibly, but deeply. And I couldn't unknow what I now knew. That I was lonely. That I had needs I hadn't admitted to, even to myself. That the distance in my marriage wasn't just a phase or a slump, it was a symptom of something we had ignored for too long. The young man, my boss's son, had become a symbol of something more than himself. He was a mirror, a reminder, a disruption. He didn't mean to be, I'm sure. He wasn't trying to destroy anything. But his presence, his eyes, his attention, had cracked open something in me that I could no longer seal shut. One evening, after a long day at work, I arrived home to find my husband already there. The house was warm with the scent of something cooking, pasta, maybe, and the low hum of the news playing from the living room. It felt almost cozy. Almost like the way things used to be. He greeted me with a smile, poured me a glass of wine, and told me to sit. He had made dinner, just like that. No anniversary, no occasion. I tried to feel touched. I tried to lean into the moment. I smiled, said thank you, and took a seat at the table. We talked. He asked about my day. I told him what I could without giving too much away. He laughed at something I said. I laughed too. It was comfortable, it was easy, and yet, under the surface, there was a tension I couldn't explain. A discomfort that pulsed just beneath my skin. Halfway through the meal, he looked up at me and said he wanted to take a vacation together. Somewhere quiet, just the two of us. Maybe the mountains. Maybe a cabin with no phones, no distractions. I nodded, slowly, uncertain of what I was agreeing to. He was trying. I could see that. And I should have felt hopeful. But instead, I felt cornered. Not by him, but by myself. By the weight of the choices I had yet to make. Later that night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things I hadn't said. About how I felt like a ghost in my own life. About how I had spent so many years playing a part, I had forgotten how to just be. And then, without warning, the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just slow, silent tears that slipped down the sides of my face into my pillow. I didn't even know what I was crying for. For the marriage that was fading? For the woman I used to be? For the life I might still want, but didn't know how to reach? I turned slightly, hoping my husband was asleep. He was. His breathing was even, his body still. I watched him for a moment, the rise and fall of his chest, the calm on his face. We looked like any ordinary couple. But inside me, everything was in motion. The next day, I called in sick. I told my assistant I had a fever. She sounded concerned. I thanked her for understanding and hung up before I had to say anything more. I wasn't sick, not in the way she thought. I just needed space, real, uninterrupted space, to think. To breathe. I stayed in my robe most of the morning, sipping lukewarm tea, walking aimlessly from room to room. Every corner of the house held some memory. The photos on the wall, the grooves in the floor, the pile of books we used to read together. It was all there. And yet, I felt like a visitor in someone else's home. By afternoon, I found myself standing in front of my closet, fingers brushing over hangers. I hadn't planned to go anywhere, but my body moved with its own intention. I got dressed, pulled my hair back, put on light makeup. I didn't know why. I just needed to feel like myself again, or maybe like someone else entirely. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I didn't head toward the office. I didn't even realize where I was going until I saw the building come into view. I parked a block away, my heart thudding. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find, or what I would say if I saw him. I wasn't even sure I wanted to see him. But something had pulled me here, and I couldn't ignore it. I didn't go inside. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the front entrance. People came and went. No one noticed me. I was just another face behind the windshield, just another silent witness to the passing of time. Eventually, I started the engine and drove away. That night, back at home, my husband mentioned the vacation again. He had already looked at cabins, already started planning. His eyes were bright with the hope of possibility. I forced a smile, nodded again. I didn't have the heart to tell him I wasn't ready. That I might never be. He reached for my hand across the table and squeezed it gently. I squeezed back. And in that moment, I realized something painful but true. Sometimes, love isn't enough. Sometimes, it withers quietly, not with a bang but with a sigh. It doesn't mean the memories aren't real. It doesn't mean the history doesn't matter. But people change. Needs shift. And if you ignore that long enough, you wake up one day and find that you've become a stranger to yourself. I didn't know what was coming next. I didn't know what choice I would make, or when. But I knew this. The person I had been was gone. And the woman who was emerging, hesitant, aching, unsure, deserved a voice. Deserved space. Deserved truth. Even if it broke everything I thought I knew. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling of everything I had once thought stable. Work became a strange refuge and a reminder of how disconnected I'd become from my own life. Each morning, I slipped into the office like an actor stepping onto a stage, playing the part of the confident, capable woman I'd always been known to be. But beneath the surface, I was fraying at the edges. I kept my distance from him, my boss's son, trying to suppress the flood of emotions that had started to break through the dam I'd built. I was painfully aware of every glance, every accidental touch, every casual smile. The memory of that kiss lingered, not as a moment of passion but as a rupture in the fabric of my carefully controlled existence. It was during one of those late nights at the office, when the building was quiet and shadows stretched long across the walls, that he approached me again. We were the only two left, a fact that made the silence between us heavier, charged. He didn't say much at first. Just leaned on the corner of my desk and looked at me with those eyes that always seemed to see right through me. The kind of look that makes you feel exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely safe. I remember thinking how absurd it was that I was still trying to act as if nothing had happened. That I could pretend our connection was purely professional when my body and mind screamed otherwise. And then, just like that, we kissed. We kissed. There were no words, no explanations. Just a simple act. A momentary crossing of boundaries that neither of us tried to define. Afterward, the world seemed to tilt slightly off its axis. I closed my office door and sat down heavily, trying to steady my breath, trying to process what I had done. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I was angry with myself or relieved. Over the next few days, our interactions shifted. There was a new tension, something unsaid hanging between us like smoke. I was painfully aware of it, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Part of me wanted to understand what I had been missing, what I had been denying for so long. At home, the distance between me and my husband grew more pronounced. He was trying, in his own way, to bridge the gap. He suggested counseling again, more insistently this time. He wanted to fix us, to find a way back. But I felt torn. I had spent years convincing myself that love alone could hold us together, but now I wasn't sure if that was enough. I realized that what I craved wasn't just love, it was connection, passion, understanding. And those things had slipped away, leaving behind only habit and obligation. One evening, he reached for me as I was getting ready for bed. It was a gentle touch, a reminder of familiarity. I didn't pull away, but I didn't respond either. There was a silence between us that said more than words ever could. I thought about the young man, about his eyes, about the way he made me feel seen. About the way that simple kiss had unlocked something inside me I didn't know was still there. I was standing at a crossroads. Could I walk back the way I came? Could I rebuild what was broken? Or was I meant to follow this new path, uncertain and daunting as it was? The next day, at work, I found myself alone with him again. The office was emptying for the night, the hum of the city outside quieting. He looked at me and said simply, "You don't have to pretend with me." And in that moment, I felt the weight of years lift slightly. I nodded, because I didn't know what else to do. We spent the night together. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about honesty. About acknowledging the parts of myself I had kept hidden. About facing the messiness of life head-on. I knew I had decisions to make. Difficult decisions. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to make them. To stop hiding behind silence and routine. Because sometimes, the only way to find yourself is to lose the world you thought you knew. The next few mornings were quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful, more like the silence after a storm, when nothing looks damaged on the surface, but you can sense the shift in the air. I moved through my routines with practiced grace, coffee, emails, meetings, polite conversation. But everything felt different now. Not just around me, but inside me. The memory of that night didn't leave me. Not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. There was no going back to pretending. I had crossed a line, not only in action but in understanding. I saw now how long I had been asleep inside my own life, how many years I had spent surviving instead of feeling. It wasn't about one night. It wasn't even about him. It was about waking up. But awakening brings consequences. Emotional ones. Practical ones. And now I was standing in the middle of a life that didn't quite fit anymore, trying to decide what to carry forward and what to let go. At home, things were confusing. My husband continued trying in small, visible ways. He made dinner twice that week. He asked me to join him for a walk after work, which I did, even though every step felt strained. We talked about surface-level things, the neighbor's new car, his workload, a show we used to watch. But nothing deeper. There was a stiffness to our conversations now, like we both knew something had shifted but neither of us had the courage to name it. He brought up the vacation again. This time with specifics, dates, rental cabins, flight options. I nodded along, unsure whether I was agreeing out of obligation or out of fear of the alternative. Saying no would mean confrontation. Saying yes meant prolonging something I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. The truth was, I didn't know how to tell him I was drifting. I didn't know how to explain that something fundamental had changed inside me, and I wasn't sure it could be repaired. I didn't know how to admit that I had already left him in so many emotional ways, even though I still lived under the same roof. One evening, I sat in our bedroom alone while he took a shower. The lamp on my nightstand cast a soft glow over the room, illuminating the familiar space in unfamiliar tones. I stared at the wedding photo on my dresser. We looked so young. So hopeful. I remembered the woman in that photo. She had believed in forever. She had trusted that love was enough. I didn't feel like her anymore. The next day at work, he was there again. My boss's son. The air between us had settled into something cautious. We didn't speak much, but there was understanding in the way we acknowledged each other. Neither of us pushed. Neither of us ignored what had happened. There was no pretending, but also no pressure. Just a quiet recognition that something had passed between us that changed the rhythm of who we were, both separately and together. That morning, we crossed paths in the elevator. We were alone. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Just real. He looked at me with a question in his eyes, one he didn't voice. And I met his gaze with something softer, something honest. I didn't have answers, and I didn't offer promises. But in that moment, I think we both understood that what we were caught in wasn't simple desire or rebellion. It was complexity. It was a need to feel seen in ways we hadn't felt in a long time. As the elevator doors opened, we walked out without a word. Later that afternoon, I got a message from my husband. He had booked the cabin for the weekend. It was done. Non-refundable, he added, as if that detail would somehow make the trip mandatory. He was excited, he wrote. He thought it would be good for us. A reset. I stared at the message for a long time. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to type something honest, something kind but firm. But I didn't. I replied with a simple, okay. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to his breathing beside me, slow and steady. My mind kept circling the same questions. Was I cruel for letting him believe we were still something we hadn't been in years? Was I selfish for wanting more than what we had become? Was it weakness or strength to admit that I didn't know how to fix what was broken? The next morning, I told him I had to stay late at work. It wasn't a lie. There were always reasons to stay late. But mostly, I just needed space. After everyone else had gone, I remained in my office with the door closed. The quiet of the building was comforting. There was something about the absence of noise that allowed my thoughts to rise to the surface. I watched the city lights blink on outside the window. The world kept spinning, indifferent to my turmoil. Eventually, there was a soft knock on my door. He stepped in, hesitant but not surprised. I think he knew I would still be there. I think we both knew this conversation had been waiting to happen. We talked. Not about what had happened, but about everything around it. About expectations. About the difference between being alive and simply existing. About loneliness, the kind that builds over time, even in the presence of someone who once loved you deeply. He didn't try to convince me of anything. He didn't ask for more than I was willing to give. He just listened. And in that, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, understood. When he left, he didn't touch me. He didn't linger. He just looked at me and said, "Take care of yourself." I stayed in that office long after he was gone. I thought about what it meant to take care of myself. Not just physically, but emotionally. Mentally. Spiritually. I thought about what I wanted, and what I had been too afraid to say out loud. I wanted more than survival. I wanted depth. Intimacy. Truth. And I knew that no one else could give me those things if I didn't first give them to myself. I still didn't know what I would say to my husband. I didn't know how I would face the weekend away or what it would mean. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about choosing between two people. It was about choosing myself. For the first time in years, I was beginning to understand what that meant. The weekend trip arrived faster than I expected. I found myself packing with mechanical detachment, folding sweaters I wasn't sure I'd wear, placing toiletries into a bag like I was preparing for someone else's journey. My husband moved around the house with a quiet excitement, humming under his breath, checking the route on his phone, printing out the reservation for the cabin. His optimism pressed against me like a weight I couldn't carry. I smiled when he looked at me, nodding at the right moments, pretending I was present. The drive was long, and the silence between us stretched wider with each passing mile. The car hummed softly over the asphalt, trees whipping past in a blur of green and gold. He played a playlist we used to listen to years ago, songs that once meant something, now just background noise. I looked out the window, watching the sky darken. We were moving forward, physically at least, but I felt further away from him than ever. The cabin was tucked deep into the woods, nestled near a lake so still it reflected the sky like a sheet of glass. It was beautiful, objectively so. A postcard setting. The air was fresh, the silence comforting in a way city noise never could be. But beauty, I was beginning to learn, didn't fix things. It couldn't patch the growing fracture inside me. He carried the bags in, talking about how this was just what we needed, a few days away from everything. I nodded again. My vocabulary had shrunk into neutral responses. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did and didn't want to ask. That first evening, we sat on the wooden deck with mugs of tea wrapped in blankets, watching the sky turn a deep violet. It should have been a moment of peace, of reconnection. Instead, it felt like a rehearsal. Like we were actors playing a married couple, reciting lines we hadn't practiced in years. He reached for my hand at one point, and I let him take it. His fingers were warm, familiar. But I felt no spark. No emotion. Just the dull throb of guilt pressing against my ribs. That night, I lay awake long after he fell asleep. The cabin creaked gently with the wind, the occasional sound of an owl echoing through the trees. I stared at the ceiling, counting the knots in the wood, thinking about how many years we had spent building something that now felt hollow. I tried to remember the last time I had truly desired him, not out of duty or comfort, but out of longing. I couldn't. And that realization sat heavy in my chest. Morning came quietly. I made breakfast while he read on the porch. We talked about hiking trails, about dinner plans, about whether or not it would rain. It was polite. Measured. It felt like we were tiptoeing around something, each afraid to say what we were really thinking. That afternoon, we walked around the lake, staying mostly on the trail. He pointed out birds, mentioned memories from other trips we'd taken. I followed beside him, offering comments when appropriate, keeping my eyes on the path ahead. My thoughts were elsewhere, floating between memories of the city, of the office, of that quiet voice that had told me to start listening to myself again. Back at the cabin, I stood in front of the mirror in the small bathroom, brushing my hair. I looked tired, older. Not from age, but from the weight of unspoken truths. My reflection held my gaze steadily, as if daring me to say it aloud, this wasn't working. That evening, something shifted. We sat by the fireplace after dinner, the light flickering against the wooden walls. He poured us each a glass of wine and started talking, not about the trip or the weather or our routines, but about us. He said he felt like he'd lost me. That he'd been trying to fix things, but didn't know how. That he missed the way we used to be, but couldn't reach me anymore. His voice trembled slightly, a rare crack in his usual composure. I listened in silence. I didn't interrupt. When he was done, he looked at me with eyes I'd known for decades, eyes that had once held every version of my past. I wanted to reach across the space between us and tell him I was still here. But the truth was, I wasn't. Not in the way he needed me to be. He asked me if I still loved him. And for a moment, the room felt completely still. I told him I did. Because I did. But I also told him that love wasn't enough anymore. That I needed more than what we'd become. That I wasn't sure how we had arrived at this distance, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. He looked away, nodding slowly. I don't think he was surprised. Deep down, I think he had known for a long time. We both had. We had just been waiting for someone to say it first. That night, we didn't speak much. We went to bed quietly, the silence no longer heavy with avoidance, but with truth. We spent the night together. It was the last night of the trip. In the morning, we packed up with quiet efficiency. No arguments, no accusations. Just the slow, deliberate folding of clothes, the sound of zippers closing, the routine of two people who knew something had ended. The drive back was even quieter than the one before. There was no music this time. Just the hum of the road, the occasional click of the blinker, and the shared knowledge that we were returning to a life that no longer felt the same. When we got home, he carried in the bags and then disappeared into the bedroom. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the closed door, knowing that we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. And I wasn't afraid. I was sad. Grieving, even. But underneath the sorrow, there was clarity. This wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't selfishness. It was the beginning of truth. And that truth, however painful, was the first step toward becoming whole again. Returning home from the cabin felt like stepping back into a house that no longer belonged to us. Everything was in its place, our shoes by the door, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint scent of lavender from the candle I always kept by the entryway. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. Not just between us, but within the walls themselves. They no longer held warmth. Only silence. For the first few days, we moved around each other like distant relatives sharing space out of necessity. There was a courtesy to it, a mutual politeness that masked the weight of what had been said, and not said, up in the woods. He cooked dinner one night. I did the next. We shared the same bed but not the same sleep. He stayed up later than usual, watching television with the volume low, and I lay in the dark, eyes open, counting the minutes until morning. At work, I found a strange kind of solace. It was the only space where I still felt a sense of control. The meetings, the spreadsheets, the small tasks that once felt tedious now provided structure, something to hold on to. My focus sharpened, not because I cared more, but because it was the only place where no one asked personal questions. No one could see what was unraveling in the quiet hours of my real life. I hadn't seen him, my boss's son, since before the weekend. I assumed he was giving me space, though I didn't know if it was out of respect or uncertainty. Either way, I was grateful. I wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. But that didn't stop me from thinking about him. He had become something more than a complication. He was a reflection, a mirror I hadn't meant to look into, but once I had, I couldn't unsee what it revealed. He hadn't changed me, not really. But he had shown me that I was already changing. That I had needs, questions, desires I had pushed away for far too long. And that truth, once acknowledged, had started to bleed into every part of my life. One evening, a few days after we returned, my husband sat across from me at the dinner table and said he had something to tell me. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not sadness. Something more quiet, more resolved. He said he'd been seeing someone. The words didn't hit me like a slap. They landed softly, like snow, settling into a place I didn't know had been waiting for them. He didn't give me details. He didn't offer timelines or excuses. He simply said it had started without planning, that it had made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, and that he didn't want to lie anymore. I listened. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just sat there, spoon halfway to my mouth, heart beating steadily, mind strangely calm. Because in that moment, everything made sense. The distance. The avoidance. The sudden efforts to fix us. It wasn't just about me. We had both been drifting. We had both been searching. We had both, in our own ways, stepped outside the lines we promised to stay within. And it didn't make me angry. It made me sad. But not in a way that asked for repair. More like mourning something that had already died quietly, long ago, and was only now being buried properly. I told him I appreciated his honesty. He looked surprised. I think he expected fury or tears. Instead, he got quiet understanding. We talked for hours that night. Not like a couple trying to salvage something. More like two people trying to untangle themselves gently, respectfully, with as little pain as possible. There was no blame. Only truth. And after so many years of silence, that felt like mercy. We agreed to take some time apart. Nothing final. Just space. Breathing room. Time to think, to feel, to decide what came next without the pressure of pretending. He offered to stay at his brother's for a while. I nodded, thanked him. The next morning, he packed a bag and left. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the hallway for a long time. The quiet that followed was different than before. It wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. The following week passed slowly. I worked late, came home to an empty house, cooked small meals for one. The solitude wasn't lonely. It was clarifying. For the first time in years, I didn't have to adjust myself to anyone else's needs, moods, or expectations. I was left with only myself, and the quiet questions that had been waiting for me all along. Eventually, I saw him again. He was walking out of a meeting when I stepped off the elevator. Our eyes met. No rush of emotion. Just a quiet recognition. He asked if I had time to talk. I said yes. We sat in a small break room at the end of the hall, away from where anyone might interrupt. The air between us was still, calm. Different than before. I told him the truth. About the trip. About the conversation with my husband. About what it felt like to finally stop pretending. He listened carefully. When I finished, he nodded. He said he had sensed something had shifted, but didn't know what. And that he was glad I had found the space to begin figuring things out. There was no declaration between us. No grand proposal. Just two people sitting quietly, sharing the strange intimacy of having seen each other's truths. He asked if I needed anything. I said I needed time. And he said, take all the time you need. That night, back at home, I lit a candle and sat on the couch with a book I never opened. I stared out the window at the quiet street, watching as the street lamps flickered on one by one. There was no rush now. No decisions to force. Only space. Only breath. Only the slow, patient work of becoming whole. The house had grown quieter in his absence, but not emptier. There was a difference, subtle but noticeable. The silence that lingered now felt chosen, not forced. For the first time in a long while, I didn't have to brace myself for the tension that once lived in every room. I moved through the space more slowly, more deliberately. I cooked small meals for myself, left books half-read on the coffee table, let sunlight spill through the windows without immediately drawing the curtains. I was learning how to be alone without feeling abandoned. Work continued as usual. My days were structured, filled with meetings, deadlines, and polite exchanges. But I had stopped running. I no longer buried myself in tasks to avoid my thoughts. I allowed stillness to stretch between responsibilities, and it was there, in that space, that I began to rebuild a relationship with myself. I hadn't spoken to my husband since he left. A few texts about the mail, a brief note about a doctor's appointment, nothing emotional. We were giving each other the space we had always needed but never known how to ask for. I didn't know what would come next for us, but I no longer felt the pressure to define it immediately. We were unwinding a marriage, gently and respectfully, and perhaps that was the most we could ask for. One evening, about a week after his departure, I sat down at the dining table and opened a blank notebook. I had no plan, no outline, just a desire to write. Not for anyone else, not to document or explain, but simply to listen to what my own voice sounded like on the page. I started with a single sentence: I don't want to disappear inside a version of myself that no longer fits. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if they had been waiting for permission. I wrote about my fears, about the loneliness that had crept in long before the kiss, about the years I had spent trying to be everything for everyone while neglecting the quiet voice inside that kept whispering, "What about you?" I wrote until the sky turned dark and the crickets began their nightly chorus outside the window. I didn't solve anything on those pages, but I made room for something to begin. And that was enough. He reached out to me the next day. My boss's son. Just a short message: coffee after work? I stared at the screen for a long time. I could have said no. I could have ignored it. But instead, I said yes. We met at a quiet cafe tucked behind a bookstore, neutral ground, away from the echo of the office. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table near the window, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert. Seeing him again stirred something in me, not desire, exactly, but recognition. A reminder of what had begun between us, and what it had forced me to confront. He smiled when I sat down, not expecting anything, just offering presence. We talked. Not about the past, not about what had happened, but about life. About transitions. About change. He told me he'd been thinking about going back to school, maybe pursuing something different than what his father had always envisioned. I listened, surprised by how much I didn't know about him outside of the small world we had shared at work. He asked how I was doing. I paused, considering how to answer. I told him the truth. That I was in between things. That I was learning to live without defining myself by someone else's expectations. That I didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long while, I was okay with not knowing. He nodded, quietly absorbing my words. There was no urgency in him, no push toward anything more. Just an understanding that we had both stepped into something complicated and come out changed. When we finished our drinks, he walked me to my car. The air was warm, the sun low in the sky, casting golden light on everything. He didn't reach for me. He didn't ask to see me again. He just said, "I'm glad you're finding your way." And I said, "I think I am." Driving home, I didn't feel conflicted. I didn't feel lost. I felt steady, grounded. Like I had made peace with a version of myself I had been afraid to face. That night, I called my husband. We spoke for nearly an hour, not about reconciliation or decisions, but about the small things, how he was doing, what I had been writing, what we both remembered from our trip to the cabin. It was gentle. Honest. Human. And when we hung up, I didn't feel the urge to cry or scream or rush to fix anything. I felt grateful. For what we had, for what we had lost, and for how we were handling it now. Over the next few days, I kept writing. I took walks around the neighborhood without my phone. I began painting again, a hobby I hadn't touched in years. I reconnected with a friend I hadn't seen since before the pandemic. I started living in small, intentional ways, not to distract myself, but to nourish the parts of me I had long ignored. I didn't make any dramatic announcements. I didn't share my story with coworkers or seek validation from friends. This process wasn't for performance. It was personal. Quiet. Sacred. Sometimes, I thought about him, my boss's son, and what might have been if things had gone differently. But I didn't romanticize it. I saw it for what it was, a catalyst. A mirror. A brief but necessary interruption that forced me to re-examine everything I had been avoiding. And as much as it had hurt, I was thankful. Because without it, I might still be asleep inside a life that no longer fit. Now, I was awake. I was uncertain. But I was free. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The finality of things never feels like it does in the movies. There's no swell of music, no decisive gesture that signals closure. It arrives slowly, like morning fog creeping over the edge of a familiar hill, barely noticeable at first, until you realize everything around you looks different. Life, I had come to understand, rarely ends in chapters. It just shifts, little by little, until you're no longer the person who began the story. That morning, I woke up with a strange calmness in my chest. The air outside was cool, and the light streaming through the window carried the golden weight of early autumn. I made coffee and drank it slowly on the back patio, wrapped in a cardigan I hadn't worn in years. The yard looked the same, unmowed in spots, the hydrangeas beginning to brown at the edges, but I felt more present in it than I had in a long time. I could hear the distant hum of the street, birds nesting in the tree above, the soft clink of my spoon in the ceramic mug. It was the kind of morning I used to rush through. Now, I let it hold me still. I had spent the last few weeks building a quieter life, one that asked fewer questions of me and demanded no performance. There was comfort in simplicity. A ritual in cleaning my own kitchen. A kind of grace in grocery shopping without a list, in pausing on a park bench just to breathe. For so long, my life had been full of movement. I hadn't realized how deeply I needed stillness. I hadn't seen my husband since the night we spoke on the phone. We hadn't needed to. There was no animosity, no rush to define what came next. We were two people giving each other space to rediscover the ground beneath us, and that, in its own way, was an act of love. A different kind, maybe, than the one we began with. But no less honest. That afternoon, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The trees had started to turn, leaves drifting down like slow confessions. I passed houses I had driven by for years but never really seen, gardens blooming wildly, toys scattered in yards, curtains pulled open just enough to catch glimpses of lives I didn't know. There was something grounding in that. Knowing everyone carried their own weight. Their own quiet unravelings. I stopped by a small local shop on the way home, one I had passed 100 times but never entered. I browsed without purpose, letting my fingers trace the spines of books, the edges of handmade ceramics, the grain of wooden shelves. The woman behind the counter smiled at me with recognition I couldn't place. Maybe I had seen her at the farmer's market. Maybe she simply recognized something in me, someone who had stopped running. When I left, I carried a journal under my arm. Not because I needed another one. But because it felt like the kind of thing I would want when I was ready to write something new. That evening, I made a simple dinner and ate by the window. The sky turned a soft amber, clouds streaked with lavender and rose. I didn't rush through it. I didn't turn on the television or scroll through my phone. I just sat with the quiet, and for the first time, it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. Later, as the stars began to show themselves one by one, my phone buzzed gently on the counter. It was him. The message was simple, thinking of you. I hope today felt good. I didn't respond right away. I read it twice, then set the phone down and stepped outside again, barefoot on the cool wooden boards of the patio. I looked up at the sky, the way the constellations blinked in slow time, and let the air fill my lungs. When I went back inside, I replied, "It did. Thank you. I didn't know what would become of us. I didn't need to. What we shared had served its purpose. It had reflected something back to me I wasn't brave enough to see on my own. It had offered connection, yes, but more importantly, it had offered a path to myself. He had been part of my story, but he wasn't the ending. Neither was my marriage. Neither was the house I was living in, or the title on my office door. I was beginning to understand that closure isn't always about cutting ties or burning bridges. Sometimes, it's about letting things remain open-ended, allowing room for grace, for change, for the quiet evolution of who we become. I went to bed early that night. I didn't bring a book. I didn't need music or white noise to fall asleep. I lay beneath the soft weight of the quilt, eyes closed, breath steady. And as sleep came gently over me, I didn't replay memories or reach for someone else's warmth. I simply existed in the stillness, whole and unfinished. Exactly as I was. Exactly as I needed to be. Exactly enough.